Moccasin Trail, Chapter 17. Jim and Tom moved into the heavy fir growth, which cut off the last glimpse of the cabin. This was all so natural, it might have been last year, when they had made camp in the same clearing and left in a daybreak, just like this, to start for Sioux country and another season of trapping. Jim's mind was a corridor of closed doors with only one flung open, the door to last year and the year before, the way back. Sunrise was almost upon them when they reached the banks of the Willamette close by the falls. They found the old one-eyed Chinook ferryman, Ayak Ka Tikkiak, lounging beside his hut with his arms folded and a look of sour disapproval on his usually stolid face. "Come on, Jake, move them lazy moccasins and cast off," Jim told him. "We want to get across the river." Jake's one eye rolled somberly in his direction, but he didn't stir. Patiently, Jim began to repeat his request in Chinook jargon, only to stop in the middle. 3 canoes filled with Injuns were making their way across the bank, a couple of 100 yards below the falls. "Much people," he said in surprise. Jake grunted. "Hyas Tilikum," he agreed, and then added, "Hyas Masaichi. Much evil? Who was this much bad people?" "Umpqua." "Oh." Jim's brow knotted impatiently. He understood now. Fort Vancouver had been full of Umpquas for a week, and so had Oregon City. It was their yearly trading expedition, which brought canoe load after canoe load of them down the Willamette from their villages far to the south. Evidently, they were beginning to start homeward. Small bunches of them would be portaging around the falls here all day and likely tomorrow. And Jake, who was a true Chinook and hated Umpquas, didn't like it. Jim, on the other hand, didn't like being delayed. Not this close to the Tualatin, with the sun nearly up. "Wah, you scared they'll steal your cabin while you ferry us?" he demanded of the old Indian. "Tom, you got anything to bribe 'em with? No sense wearing the horses out swimming 'em when they's got a boat right here." "Hoss, I'm about as plumb broke as a man can get. But you might try 'em on some of these here beads. The Nez Pierces like 'em." Jim took a packet of blue beads and offered it to Jake, jabbering menacingly in Chinook jargon, meanwhile and making gestures of haste. Jake took the beads and, after looking each one over separately, stowed them in his dirty sash. But they could not get him to budge until the 3 canoes were landed, hoisted to the heads of the paddlers, carried around the portage, and set afloat again above the falls. Then, at last, the old Chinook grunted and consented to man his ferry. No more than half an hour had elapsed in all, but the incident had marred Jim's dream-like peace of mind. As they scrambled up the steep rise on the east side of the river and set off toward the mountains, he found himself hurrying Buckskin, turning out of his way to avoid passing familiar fields and cabins of settlers he knew. The Umpquas were on his mind, too, touching him with vague uneasiness. They were a troublesome crew. Joe Meek's disciplinary sortie into their territory last month had been only one of many, and the faces Jim had observed as the straggling line passed by him on the way around the portage had been harsh-mouthed and sullen, with flat, blank eyes. He had heard the Umpquas kept slaves. He shook himself free from his depression, irritably hustling bad medicine, who wanted mullishly to poke. Mullishly to poke. I think that means he wanted to go slow. Suppose they did keep slaves. Suppose they were as ugly as cayuses and mean as Apaches. They lived far away south and were going there as fast as they could. They'd bring no trouble to the cabin on the Tualatin. He's worried about his family. What The Sam Hill's eatin' you, hoss, came Tom's amused complaint behind him. That mare's going like her tail was afire. You in a hurry? Jim laughed and forced himself to a leisurely pace, trying to shut those troublesome doors tight again. He began reckoning their probable route ahead. 4 days, maybe 5, across the Cascades, just south of Mount Hood, over the Umatillas, and along the Snake, south through Cache Valley and Brown's Hole. They rode up and still up. Up and up and still up that day, through the thick forests and across the ever-steepening ridges of the foothills. In the late afternoon, they put Moki to work, smelling out game for them and roasting chunks of venison haunch over their campfire that night. It was more than a little chilly up here in the high country, and the fire glowed bright and comforting under the dark canopy of the firs. The meat was warm in Jim's belly, and Tom's drawl was as slow and humorous as ever. Everything was the same, just as it used to be, but Jim was unaccountably restless. He got up so many times to check Buckskin's tether or relocate the mule or pad down to the nearby spring for a drink that Moki, who sprang up each time to go with him, finally gave a little whining yawn of protest and flopped down rebelliously beside the fire. Tom threw back his head and laughed until Jim had to grin. By golly, hoss, I can't say as I blame the dog. You'll have him wore out afore morning if you keep this up. What's eatin' you, boy? You're jumpy as a prairie dog in an anthill. Something on your mind? Nah, just can't settle down. Gimme my rifle yonder, Tom. I'll give it a cleanin'. You cleaned it twice already, hoss. You want to borry my pipe? Borry my pipe? Nothing like a clean pipe for putting a man to sleep. Oh, nothing like a pipe for putting a man to sleep. But Jim only shook his head and rolled himself in the grizzly robe to lie staring into the fire. It was a long time before he fell asleep. There was no hurrying the next day, because they were climbing in earnest now. The earth tilted up beneath the horses' feet until their path, perforce, became a zigzag back and forth across the reaching slopes. They camped on a hillside strewn with boulders and huckleberry bushes, and were off at first light, their robes still fast around them to ward off the bite in the air. Up and up, across a perilous ridge and up again through the thinning trees. They were not far from the lofty spine of the Cascade Range now. Mount Hood loomed huge and near on their left hand, its craggy peak thrusting high out of a wreath of mist. It was still early morning on this third day when Jim thought he heard a shout. He reined in, staring in disbelief around the wild, deserted scrub thickets and rocky slopes that were their trail. It was wilderness complete. Not even Indians frequented this high country. There could be no one here to shout. But even as he started on, it came again, far off and garbled, but unmistakably a human voice. Tom pushed up beside him. Hoss, am I going crazy, or do you hear that too? I hear it all right, and look at Moki. The dog was standing rigid a little distance ahead, 1 foot upraised and ears stiffly cocked. He gave a gruff little bark and bounded forward. Might as well find out what's up, Tom said. Looks like it's right on our way anyhow. Curious but wary, they rode through the scrub and into a stand of fir. More noises began to drift to them, distant bangings and a curious sort of screeching, and as they drew nearer, an occasional bawl that sounded for all the world like cattle or oxen. What the devil? Muttered Tom. They made good time as they emerged from the trees and pounded briefly across a rocky level, then plunged into another tilted grove. The noises were plainer now, dominated by men's voices, shouting some sort of orders. Tom and Jim burst out of the grove and pulled up short, for the earth had opened before them into a vast declivity, a canyon so deep the timber at its bottom looked dwarfed. It stretched on either hand as far as they could see, pitching steep enough down through their own side, but on the other rising almost sheer. They both recognized that opposite slope. It was the hill where the laurels grew, and most formidable barrier between them and the summit of the range. But it was not at Laurel Hill they stared. Incredulous, their eyes were riveted on the object at its top, a familiar, swayback object, teetering on the very brink of that perilous drop. It was a trail-worn bourgeois wagon. Immediately, the talk at Rutledge's flashed into Jim's mind. By Gor, they are coming overland. The thundering fools! His eye traced a curious zigzag mark down the face of the slope. Tom saw it too. Good suffering catfish, hoss. One of 'em's done it already. Or I can't read sign. Looky there. He pointed downward. There, far below, a stained canvas top crept across the timbered floor of the canyon like a stubby caterpillar crawling through grass. By Gor, Jim whispered. By thunder. He lapsed incoherently into crow, feeling excitement different from any he'd ever known. His eyes snapped upward to the wagon at the top. It had moved. The 4 oxen were already over the brink, struggling in a wide diagonal down the face of the drop. Jim stiffened with dread. It looked like suicide. But forward came the wagon, over the brink. It tilted crazily, swayed and lurched and bounced, but somehow stayed upright as it drew away from the crest. The tiny figure of a man came zipping and sliding on the upward side of the oxen, leaning almost horizontal as he braced his weight against the animal's ropes. A huge tree had been chained to the rear axle to drag behind and act as a brake. So they're coming down that steep slope, and they've chained a tree to slow the oxen from plummeting down this steep ridge. What would have happened without the tree, Jim could only guess. Even with it, there was no controlling that top-heavy vehicle once the hill claimed it. The oxen scrambled and slid and skidded faster and faster in a frantic effort to escape the weight which bore down on them relentlessly, banging and bumping and careening at their heels. But by the time they were halfway down the slope, their progress had turned into a headlong rush, raising clouds of dust so thick it almost obscured the scene, filling the air with a wild confusion of noises. Oxen's bawling and men's hoarse yells, the piercing squeal of wagon wheels, and the crashing of limbs as they were ripped off the dragged tree and flew spinning into the air. It was an act of chaos and daring, of courage so reckless that it etched itself on Jim's mind, never to be erased. He sat rigid on his fidgeting mare, and unconscious of his fingers knotting on the halter as he was of Tom's soft and constant swearing at his side. Then suddenly it was over. The dust settled, and there was the wagon, motionless near the foot of the slope, where a great tree lay directly across its path. A faint cheer rose from the top of Laurel Hill, and looking up again, Jim saw a line of people at the brink. Children, women, men. A bunch of cattle and horses were even now being prodded over the edge to start their scrambling way downward. Another wagon loomed behind them, and he knew there were more behind it. These bourgeois, they fought the country, but they conquered it. Stubborn, brave, magnificent fools who didn't know an impossibility when they saw one. Fools? They were heroes. They had a medicine so big nothing could withstand it. Nothing could withstand it. Suddenly, the scene before Jim's eyes was blotted out, and another rose. He saw the vast sweep of the plains, with wagons like this everywhere, crawling in little clouds of dust over every corner of the continent, turning off south and north to halt on the plateaus, to seek out valleys, to swarm among the mountains, to penetrate even the wild fastness of the Absaroka. And everywhere they stopped, cabins mushroomed, gardens planted, dark furrows laid their stripes across the earth. Indians were crowded backward, bunching and milling. Buffalo herds were scattered and slain and gone, and the prairies were no longer empty but teeming with life. Towns sprang up to obliterate lonely graves. cattle fed where once the coyote howled. The vision was gone almost before he glimpsed it, but its effect was staggering. Breathing hard and blinking, feeling the little hairs raise on the back of his neck, Jim shook himself back to the present. He felt as if everything were suddenly different. Himself changed in some way he could not fathom. The whole world knew, yet only an instant had passed. The cattle were scrambling down the slope yonder, the dust still settling below. Tom gave a sudden whoop of delight and pointed downward. The wagon which had just made the furious descent stood deserted, its tongue lolling, while the man slapped his oxen angrily into place beside the great tree that barred his way. He roped the beasts to it, every motion one of exasperation, and they dragged it laboriously out of the way. Hitched to the wagon once more, they lumbered the remaining 50 yards down the slope and pulled up short on level ground, halted by the weight of the tree still dragging behind their own load. Instantly the man was off the high seat and cutting the tree free, serenely leaving it in exactly the same spot as the log which had so angered him. He resumed his seat, and the wagon disappeared into the timber. Tom threw back his head and roared, "I knowed it! You watch, hoss. The next done down'll do the same doggone thing. By golly, if that ain't human nature." Jim never knew how long it was they stayed there, watching. He didn't even notice when Bad Medicine lay down, pack and all, in the middle of the trail. But by the time they finally nudged and prodded and kicked him to his unwilling feet and started their horses down the near side of the canyon, the first 2 wagons were straining up it. 3 more squealed faintly far below, crossing the timber floor. As Jim and Tom moved down parallel to the second wagon, its owner spotted them and hailed. Riding ahead of Tom, Jim ordered Moki to keep the mule on his feet and cut across the incline at an angle, intercepting the wagon on a slanting shelf. The man ran forward eagerly. "You comin' from west'ard?" he demanded. "Yep." "Willamette Valley?" "Yep." "By gollies, is it fur, boy?" Jim shook his head. 4 or 5 days in a wagon, maybe less. 4 days? You hear that, Martha? The man yelled jubilantly into the wagon. 4 or 5 days, we'll be there. He swung back to Jim. "Say, boy, is it all they say 'tis? The land and all? Can a man make a livin'?" There was nothing you'd ever notice about this man. He was undersized and scrawny, with a face you'd never be able to pick out in a crowd. Farmer, bourgeois, nobody. He was just another man. Yet, with his own eyes, Jim watched him beat his oxen over that drop, slip, and slide, and curse his way down beside them, fight the very mountain itself, and do the impossible. "You'll do all right, mister," he said huskily. "You'll do fine. They's a good valley down yonder, best I ever see, and plenty folks just like you. By gor, it's wuth the trip." He wheeled his mare and plunged down the slope, the up-thrust treetops swimming suddenly in a watery blur as his mind filled with Johnny's face and the cabin on the Tualatin. He never remembered much about the next couple hours. Somehow he and Tom scrambled up Laurel Hill, crossed the ridge beyond, and rode up and on through layers of swirling mist. Mount Hood, towering huge and close to the left of them, appeared and reappeared through the vapor like a gigantic phantom. Jim rode unseeing, his own thoughts swirling in a misty confusion of images and voices. The wagon careening down Laurel Hill, Sally's shining hair, and fierce little profile, Dan'l's eager laughter, fields deep with grain where forests once stood, Rutledge's deep voice saying, "If there ain't no other way to get here, I reckon they'll make it." And Meek's, "Why, hallelujah, I don't know what, boy, but something big. Ain't you seen them wagons coming over the plains?" So Meek had glimpsed that vision too. It was big. By gor, it was bigger than all outdoors. And Johnny had seen it all along. Clear as sudden daybreak, Jim remembered his black eyes blaze with it. Heard his voice saying, "Why, this is home. It's what we come all the way to get." And here was Jim Keith, leaving it. Suddenly the confusion was gone from his mind. He didn't know he'd halted his beasts until Tom came pushing back through the clouds of mist toward him. "What's the matter, hoss? That cussed mule acting up again?" Jim sat without moving or speaking. Then suddenly he said, "Tom, let's go back." "Go back?" Tom nudged Tucky closer, peering intently into Jim's face. Slowly his own changed, and a slackness crept over his body. He looked down at his thumbnail, smiling a little. "I wondered when you was going to find out," he said quietly. "Find out what?" "That you belonged right where you was, back yonder." "You knowed it?" Jim faltered. "Why, sure I knowed it. I knowed it first night I saw you and heard you talk about your brother and all. I even told you, hoss, if you just think back." Jim thought and remembered. "Tom, I didn't know what you meant. I thought maybe you was saying you'd rather trap alone." Rivers gave a short, soft laugh. "I reckon that's why I climbed a couple mountain ranges to hunt you up. No, but once I found you, I knowed how your stick was floating. You're dead right, Jim. Go back." "By thunder, you'll come too." Tom smiled again, slowly shaking his head. There was complete finality in that gesture. "Nope, hoss, I tried it, but it ain't my trail. When a man's spent 20 years beaverin', I reckon he's ruined for anything else." Jim stared in silence at the lean, tough figure with its battered hat, dark against the rolling white vapor. "That's it, then?" "That's it, hoss," Tom said easily. A swirl of mist drifted between them, blurring the trapper's outlines until he seemed almost to dissolve like a ghost, lacking all solid substance. And a ghost he was, Jim realized slowly, a man whose day was past, whose way of life had vanished, heading back to a world which no longer existed. He knew now what had bothered him so these last weeks, why Tom moved alone through the noisiest crowd. A soft laugh broke into his thoughts. "Sho, boy, don't look like that. Climb off and we'll have us a farewell feed, and a smoke for luck." Jim obeyed, but he couldn't respond to the other's drawling banter. The jerky choked him, and the smoke Tom puffed to east and west and north and south melted eerily into the fog. Too soon they rose and melted once more, and the moment had come. "Now listen, hoss," Tom said. "It ain't forever. I'll likely wander out this way next summer, less'n some Blackfoot gets me first." Ain't the Blackfoot lives that's fast enough to get you, Tom." Tom Rivers grinned and wheeled his horse. "It might take two of 'em," he drawled. He gathered his reins, his face suddenly bleak. "Good huntin', Jim. Take care of that medicine. It's done a powerful big magic." He raised his hand in farewell, and Jim returned the gesture without trusting his voice to speak. Tucky's hoofs rang on the mist-wet rock. The man and horse moved away, and Jim watched until they vanished into the drifting layers of white. Faint jingling of traps floated back on a wisp of breeze. Then even that faded. Jim stood alone in a swirling emptiness. Slowly he turned and started down the mountain. Tom would come back next summer, and the summer after, and the summer after, each time more ghost-like and remote. Then would be clear that at last some Blackfoot or Comanche, or maybe two, had been faster than Tom Rivers. Slowly, out of his desolation, a certain quiet settled over Jim. Why struggle against what couldn't be changed? That was the life Tom wanted, and the death he would choose. A man seldom got more, and many a man got half so much. As for himself, he was through looking backward. He and Tom had parted once more in high country, but this time each was sure of his trail. That was the difference. He rode on, downward and downward now, through the thinning mists and into brilliant sunlight. Below him stretched a vast and slanting landscape, deep with timber, easing into the gentler slopes of foothills and finally leveling off into the valley he knew and loved as he had never loved a place before. And far off yonder flowed the still waters of the Tualatin, and a cabin on its banks were three people who meant more to him than all his wild and lonely freedom. My valley, he thought, my people, home. A dark and glorious music rose up inside him as he looked, like thunder, like rolling clouds, like rivers and drums and running horses. All of it shot through with the bright, quick notes of Johnny's banjo. It filled him, spilled over into a shout of joy that echoed down through the forest. It brought his heels back against Buckskin's sides with a kick that sent her scrambling and sliding in a wild rush down the mountainside, with the mule stumbling behind. The way would be swift now that they were racing downward instead of toiling up, now that they were going home. The music still echoed in his ears as he stood on the east bank of the Willamette just 5 mornings after he had quitted it, and shouted joyfully across the river to Jake. It rang all around him as he spurted off the ferry on the other side and plunged through the tangle of oaks and wild plum that bordered the mill's claim. It drowned the thudding of the animals' hooves and Moki's excited barking and the pounding of his own heart as he sped through the last familiar stretch of wood and into the clearing, sliding to the ground just as Sally emerged from the doorway of the cabin, Mrs. Rutledge and the twins behind her. She stopped short, and he came toward her eagerly. "Sally, I'm back. Then he stopped too. The music broke off in a crashing discord. Her eyes were red from weeping, her usually volatile face dull and weary. She stood with shoulders sagging, her hands limp at her sides. "So you're back," she echoed. "Well, you're too late." He's gone." "Gone? Who's gone?" "Dan'l." "Dan'l? Gone where? What in thunder?" "Nobody knows where," she burst out. Suddenly she began to cry. "If we knew, you think we'd waste time hunting through every Injun camp this side of—" "Injun camp? Blast it. Tell me what you're talking about." "Dan'l's what I'm talking about." She almost screamed at him, her hands clenched with fury. "You just rode away and left him, Jim Keith. You went off without saying one word, and it's like to broke his heart. Day before yesterday we woke up and he was gone. They was only this." She thrust her fist out toward him and opened it, and on the palm lay a crumpled piece of deerskin, covered with Dan'l's sprawling, flourishing writing. "Yes, I'll read it to you," she flung at him, her scorn so like a lash that he went rigid under it. She spread the scrap of hide in her hands and shook convulsively, as did her voice. "Dear Johnny and Sis, don't try to find me. I have gone away like Jim done, to be an Injun. And Johnny and the men huntin' never got a sign. And Johnny and the men huntin' ever Injun town in Fort Vancouver for 3 days and nights, and not a sign of him. They're up at Mullins's now, getting food and fresh horses to hunt some more. But they can't find him. Oh, they can't find him." She buried her face in her hands, suddenly the words breaking into sobs. "See what you done, Jim Keith. I wish we'd never seen you." Slowly, painfully, Jim gathered the tattered remnants of his thoughts and forced them into some sort of coherence. "I know whar he is," he muttered, her head lifted, her eyes wildly questioning. He nodded. "He's got to be. Ain't no other way to—" He broke off, moistening his dry lips while he struggled to make plans. "Go to the Mullinses," he said hoarsely. "Go fast. I'll leave the mules. Tell Johnny I've gone to get the boy back, southward along the river. They can follow if they want." He wheeled and ran for Buckskin, not wanting to see how she took it or what she did. Back he pounded through the woods he had ridden through so joyously a few moments before. But this time his hands were like ice and his mouth dry with fear. One terrible picture before his eyes. A line of sullen Indians with flat, blank eyes, carrying their canoes around the portage. The Umpquas, who kept slaves.